the Irish economic miracle, in inverted commas, was never meant to happen. A poor country like Ireland wasn't meant to, like Ireland in the space of a decade went from one of the poorest countries in in the Western world to, on paper, the fourth wealthiest country in the world in the space of a school generation. It was something that was hard for people on the left to come to terms with. I think the initial response was to suggest this was a souffle, that this was a bubble, that this wouldn't last. But certainly, when you see apartment blocks going up, when you see cranes on the skyline, when you talk to your students and they've just come back from the Far East over the summer, when you talk to your students and they've just come back from a week in Prague during the midterm break, all of those kind of stories attest to something that was happening. And I think what happened with the left during that period, and again I include myself in this, much to my regret, was that people's a way of interrogating that particular period was through cultural categories rather than economic categories.
Welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. It's Thursday, the 6th of February, and we're here to discuss the Irish elections today. My name's Alex Hochuli. I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil. As usual, George Hoare is in London. Hello, George.
Hey.
And Phil Cunliffe is in Canterbury, England. Hi, Phil.
Hey.
So this episode is coming out to you on Friday, the 7th of February. The elections are the day after. You might be hearing this after, but all that should be contained herein should still be very relevant, whether you know the result or not. This obviously is an opportunity to talk about Ireland and not just an opportunity for Phil to ask questions about how Brexit fits into this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more germane here that Sinn Féin, I think, are polling at like 24%, which is quite a shock, and could be up for a major upset, at least in terms of what you might have expected to have happened a few years ago. Could be the Irish political establishment getting a bit of a shaking,
and a couple of almost like a decade too late after like the really severe crisis there. I mean, I don't know enough about Irish politics as I should do, but the two main parties are kind of two really boring centre-right parties who've just governed Ireland forever. So it'll be interesting to see if that is cracking up in the same way that so many other political establishments are cracking up all over the place, as we've discussed on a number of other episodes prior to this one. So rather than us just waffle on.
That said, it's also there's historic questions as well, because forever in the context of Ireland means about 100 years of independence. So I think tying that in, also bringing in the backdrop of Irish history, is also would be useful to do.
Yeah, and the context, I guess, of the comparing Ireland to Greece or to some of the other pigs, and I guess the economic context is particularly important in recent
What's a pig?
Irish history. What's a pig? A pig's what you make of it. No, it's Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. The periphery of Europe, if you will.
Yeah.
The indebted countries of the Eurozone. Pigs. It's a phrase that fell out as the kind of Eurozone crisis has receded, economically at least. But was very prominent some years back.
Yeah. Right.
There's two eyes, so maybe it should be pigs. Or maybe not.
Right. So rather than us waffle on about pigs and other things, we are going to call up Colin Coulter, who will tell us a lot more about Ireland. He's a sociology lecturer at Maynooth University. He's written about the Irish end of history, which is obviously we quite like. Not that we like the end of history, but we like it as a theme, as regular listeners will know. And has written about Ireland as the model pupil or the model prisoner of Eurozone austerity. And he apparently also has a new book out on The Clash, the band The Clash, and the crisis of social democracy at the end of the 70s and the coming of Thatcherism, which sounds fascinating, but unfortunately we're not going to be able to broach that subject today. We'll have to talk to Colin about that at another point in the future. All right, here is us talking to Colin. Colin, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
So just to get us started, we should go for an obvious hook and ask, these Irish elections, are we looking at an upset? Is there going to be a populist upsurge in Ireland? And I think if it did happen, it would maybe be one of the last places in Western Europe to experience one. And maybe not just a populist upsurge, but a left populist one in the form of Sinn Féin. They're riding around 24% in the poll. So to start us off, Colin, could you tell us, are we looking at an upset here?
Yeah, possibly. Sinn Féin, I think against everybody's kind of predictions, probably including their own, they didn't put up, they're only standing, I think, 42 candidates, which is nowhere near enough to form a government. But in the last couple of weeks, they've had a huge surge in the polls. Although quite often the polls overstate how the opinion polls quite often overstate how they actually do in elections. But Sinn Féin are a kind of strange beast in many respects. People often refer to them as populist. Of course, that can mean many different things, but they're a strange kind of a blend of a kind of fairly kind of conventional version of Irish republicanism with varying kind of versions of kind of socialist ideology, not necessarily a socialist party, but a party with socialists in it. The kind of longer tradition of populism in Southern Irish politics is probably more closely associated with Fianna Fáil, which has historically been the largest party in Southern Ireland and has really had that kind of catch-all ability to appeal to different sections of Irish society, very much synonymous with the kind of boom years of the Celtic Tiger, tried to kind of speak out of, as it's saying in this part of the world, speak out of both sides of its mouth at the same time, appeal to the kind of property class, the kind of building class, but also claim to be socialist. So there's kind of lots of kind of strands of populism in Ireland, but certainly Sinn Féin would resist that kind of characterization. But certainly they have a level of popularity south of the border that is unprecedented in recent times. They've had a difficult 2 or 3 days. Their past has come back predictably to haunt them. A number of events that happened a decade or two ago that members of the Provisional IRA, of which Sinn Féin is the political wing, a number of murders that they were involved in, that they witnessed and didn't report, have come back to haunt them predictably. But we possibly are looking at an upset, but the most likely outcome is a hung parliament of some description.
So, Colin, I think before we go any further, we should actually ask, as you've mentioned, the chaos of the past few decades, this election here, how important is this election, if you can quantify such a thing? Is this an epochal one? Are the grounds really shifting, or is this going to lead to a bit more of the same? I mean, you mentioned the fact that, you criticize perhaps the notion of Sinn Féin as a populist party in quotation marks at this, and we ourselves are pretty critical of that notion of populism as sort of a catch-all label. At the same time, what Sinn Féin are doing, as you've described, is portraying Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as, two of the same parties, part of the establishment, and we're something different. And in that regard, it fits very much the sort of populist model that you see across Europe.
Sure.
Yeah, firstly, how important is this election, or how important do you imagine it being?
All of the elections really of the last dozen years have been critical. Perhaps the most likely outcome is one of the most likely outcomes is a Fianna Fáil government with a sequence of coalition parties around them, which would be catastrophic. The most likely outcome is possibly the chaos of nobody being able to form a government. But it's really hugely important because it compounds a trend. I mean, if you go back a generation, the two main parties here were getting 70-80% of the vote. They're now down, possibly in this election, to the low 40s. It is possible, unlikely, but it is possible there may actually be a left government formed with Sinn Féin at its centre, although the numbers probably don't add up for that. I think it's really, really important because this is an election that's taken place in the context of where's Ireland going to go now? In the context of Brexit, in the context of having the highest rates of economic growth anywhere in the developed world, but having record levels of people on trolleys in hospitals, record levels of homelessness, record levels of rents, especially in Dublin. So there is really a moment here where the direction of where Ireland's going to go is obviously up for grabs. Although, to be honest, it looks as if that's the outcome of this election isn't going to be cut and dried. It seems as if things are going to be left hanging, possibly.
So is it too much of a simplification, I guess, building on this question of where's Ireland going, to say that you have three main paths, a kind of left establishment, a right establishment path, and then a left populist of some sort path, which is Sinn Féin?
I think there's possibly only really two there, because I think there's certainly a centre-right consensus which has kind of prevailed here, with a kind of populist tinge under Fianna Fáil, which has prevailed here really for the last 25 years. This is the first time possibly where there is at least a possibility of a kind of a left government with a populist programme. Sinn Féin claim that they're going to build 100,000 public sector houses, the most ambitious programme in the history of state within this period of government, which is an exciting claim, which of course is frowned upon and which is kind of undermined at every turn by journalists and politicians alike. But there is the possibility of Sinn Féin being at the head of a government which takes the country in a very different direction. Although, of course, with compromises. One of the things that got Sinn Féin into trouble in the past was questioning Ireland's corporation tax, which I'm sure we'll come back and discuss at some point during the conversation. But that's something that they've compromised on. They agree with the consensus now that the corporation tax will remain where it is. But I mean, Sinn Féin has is quite often dismissed as being populist, but certainly it's hugely important in all sorts of ways. I'm not a supporter. I'm not a voter. I would be a supporter of parties to the left of them, but they have certainly a real role to play in terms of bringing a certain kind of idea of social justice back to mainstream discussion after a sequence of essentially neoliberal policies for an entire generation, really going back to the 1990s.
So I suppose two questions follow from that. Has there been like a cordon sanitaire in Irish politics in which Sinn Féin has been excluded by the other parties from any kind of power or coalition agreement, in the past at least? And also, how has Sinn Féin, or to what extent has Sinn Féin altered its pitch to voters in order to make the gains that they have, or is it purely a reaction against the other establishment parties, of which Sinn Féin is now the beneficiary?
I think, the cordon sanitaire thing is a good place to start with them, because, of course, we have Sinn Féin is an all-Ireland party, but there are two jurisdictions on the island, and there is a regional UK Assembly in Belfast and, of course, a National Assembly in Dublin. Sinn Féin is one of the two principal parties in the Belfast Assembly, but it is not a member of government south of the border. The two parties that have historically dominated power south of the border have both said that they won't form a coalition government with them, which is, of course, deeply hypocritical, because they have been encouraging unionists north of the border, many of whom, of course, lost loved ones during the IRA campaign, during the Troubles, to form governments with Sinn Féin. So there's a great deal of double standards here. But there is a sense of trying to keep Sinn Féin at arm's length, partly because of the whiff of cordite, the association with the Northern Irish Troubles, but more recently because in the chaos of the last dozen years or so, of the crash and the attempts to come out of the crash, Sinn Féin has been the biggest beneficiary. There are parties to the left of Sinn Féin, but Sinn Féin is the voice that is critical of austerity and post-austerity programmes, that has really managed to get a foothold with the electorate. So really, Sinn Féin's apparent appeal in the polls is because they have been able to very, very adroitly say both of these parties are the same. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, the two big establishment parties, are essentially the same, which is a very easy argument to make because it's essentially true. It's very, very difficult to distinguish between the two of them other than whose grandfather fought on which side of the Irish Civil War nearly a century ago. So
who's the new Sinn Féin voter? What do they look like? I mean, where are they from? How might they have voted in the past?
I think looking to Northern Ireland is probably a good indication of maybe what's going on in Southern Ireland, because historically north of the border, Sinn Féin's vote was in working class Catholic nationalist communities. And over the last 20 years, they have increased their appeal beyond that, really kind of best illustrated by in North Belfast, Sinn Féin taking North Belfast for the first time with John Finucane, of course, a middle-class solicitor, son of a murdered lawyer, of course, Pat Finucane, and very much indicative of Sinn Féin's ability to go beyond, the nationalist ghettos towards kind of middle-class professional people. I think there's an element of that south of the border. Certainly Sinn Féin's appeal is very much an urban working class one. But it has, I think, for young people, I was talking to a colleague today who teaches politics in the university we both work in, and he did a straw poll with his students, and assuming that the Greens would be getting a big vote among people of that age, 18, 19, 20, Sinn Féin were way ahead among his class. There does seem to be that sense that Sinn Féin have... they've never been in power south of the border, so therefore they haven't been in a position to introduce policies that people are offended by. There's a certain radicalism about them. There's, I think, the leadership, specifically the new leader, Mary Lou McDonald, who's been in that position of president for 2 years, is very different from the old version of Sinn Féin. She didn't go to prison. Members of her family didn't go to prison. She's from South Dublin. She's middle class. She's not from a traditional Republican background. So there's what Sinn Féin have done has been to try and slip off some of that baggage while tapping into that old Republican baggage, while tapping into that sense of dismay, first in the crash that happened in Ireland, and secondly, that the recovery in Ireland is one that's made a very substantial minority of people a lot worse off. So they cover a number of bases. There are many different things as parties tend to be, but I think they've certainly, they seem to be going beyond that kind of those traditional working class roots and appealing to a much wider audience.
So let's actually go back, because I think it'd be worth spelling out for our listeners, what the centre-right consensus is, who, as parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are. I mean, from the outside, they seem hardly distinguishable centre-right parties, but they've dominated Irish politics since independence. So maybe, first of all, if you could give us an overview of where both came from, starting with the Civil War. Because I think the tendency would be, for those familiar with certainly Western European politics, would be to read these as, well, one's kind of centre-left, one's kind of centre-right, and they both have dominated politics in much the way as Social Democrats and Christian Democrats have dominated German politics or wherever. That obviously isn't the case. So maybe if you could spell out what those histories are, where those parties come from, and maybe what their bases are today.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the kind of running jokes of Irish politics, which is that they're indistinguishable. The point of origin is essentially in the Irish Civil War, the dispute over whether to recognise the treaty that would end the Black and Tan War, the War of Independence, as it would be called here, and ideologically, very, very difficult to distinguish. Historically, Fine Gael, very much the party of the big property owners, a party that has its specific origins in 1930s era fascism, the Blue Shirt movement, Fianna Fáil, a party with a rather wider kind of social appeal, very much roots in kind of small farmers, also an appeal to the urban working class. Micheál Martin, the party leader, said today that they were the party of the working class. So Fianna Fáil has always had that catch-all appeal. It's always attempted to appeal to small farmers, poor urban Irish people, whereas Fine Gael has always been seen as the party of the elite, the party of the establishment, although very hard to distinguish, certainly in the time that I've lived in Southern Ireland, very hard to get a cigarette paper between the two of them. Really, since the late 1980s, both of them have adhered to the same kind of neoliberal playbook. Very, very difficult to distinguish between the two of them at all. I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm from a unionist background. I'm not really versed in the kind of the lore of Irish nationalist history. And I have to be honest, I've spent 25 years here and I can't distinguish between those two parties. I'll go to the grave unable to distinguish between those two parties. But essentially, they're different in their tone, but in terms of what they do in power, they really, that metaphor of not being able to put a cigarette paper between them seems pretty apt to me.
And they have even supported each other in government, right? I mean, you had a minority government being supported, the Fine Gael minority government being supported by Fianna Fáil, right?
Well, they never have actually until this parliament that's just been dissolved. They've always been the big two competitors, and historically Fianna Fáil has held power more often. Quite often held power without a coalition partner more often. Fine Gael is the smaller of the two parties, has quite often gone into power with this kind of small, quite conservative Irish Labour Party. This is the first time that there's really been any kind of coalition between the two, with Fianna Fáil as kind of having a confidence in supply kind of arrangement, like the DUP and the Conservatives, where essentially they agree that they won't vote against the government in motions of no confidence. So it's not a coalition as such. It's essentially a marriage of convenience that was very much couched in 2016 because there was no definite outcome to the election. It was very much couched as, predictably, as being in the national interest. We were emerging from crisis. The recovery, as it's called, was not yet stable and mature, and we needed to be mature ourselves, and everybody needed to put the Civil War distinctions behind them and pull on the green jersey and basically hold their noses and agree to be agree to get along with one another. But no, it's there's actually never been a coalition between those two parties, although the norm in Southern Ireland is coalition government, quite often between what appear at first glance peculiar bedfellows, such as say Fine Gael, which is a kind of right-wing Thatcherite high establishment party, and the Irish Labour Party, which has included remnants of old kind of Stalinist and Trotskyist kind of influences.
Sorry, just really quickly to jump in. So beyond the three main parties, what's the role of the smaller parties? Are they particularly looking to play a significant role in this upcoming election?
Yeah, well, I mean, historically, because of the nature of the chaos of that version of kind of coalition government, quite often quite small parties have exercised very, very strong influence. The Progressive Democrats in the 1990s and the 2000s were essentially a Thatcherite breakaway from Fianna Fáil, who were in government with Fianna Fáil, who were very pro-market, very pro-multinational capital, very the cheerleaders of the use of Shannon Airport as a conduit for American troops on the way to theatres of war in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. More recently, both Labour and the Greens have had periods in coalition government, although, of course, again, predictably, both of them have had disastrous experiences. Both of them effectively were wiped out because they were essentially in coalition governments that were imposing austerity measures that were among the harshest, certainly outside of Greece, the harshest austerity program in the European Union. So one of the strange things about Irish political life and Irish political culture, it is quite small groupings can punch above their weight and can connect into the system. And one of the things I think for British kind of and American people might seem a little strange is, of course, that you have fully fledged Trotskyists in the Dáil. You've got half a dozen people who have another been involved in the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and they've fragmented somewhat, but there are half a dozen there who have held their seats for the last couple of Dáils, or the last couple of parliaments, but some of them will be clinging on for dear life come the weekend, I think, unfortunately.
Right. I mean, it is curious, as you say, because in many other places, especially, I guess, in the Anglophone world, traces of the radical left have been completely expunged from formal politics. And I think maybe that would be a good opportunity to delve back into the past. As we on this podcast like to discuss the end of history and what we're living through now, the end of history, I think it might be worth returning to sort of maybe the early 90s in Ireland, and then building our way forward, doing that kind of more chronologically. Because what I wanted to ask is that Ireland seems to be, and seem to have lived through in the 90s and 2000s, a sort of peak Fukuyamaist period to really encapsulate the end of history, the idea of leaving old passions behind, be they nationalist or socialist or whatever, and just embrace a world of neoliberal consumerism as the sort of final horizon of what you could hope for in life. And because Ireland seemed to be doing quite well out of it, it could live in that kind of post-historical bubble. Do you think that's a fair characterization? I mean, you've written specifically on Ireland's end of history. So do you see that as a fair characterization of Irish social and political life in the 90s and 2000s?
Yeah, I don't think any country, certainly in the Western world, I don't think there's a country that exemplifies those kind of ideological currents or those kind of historical arcs of boom and bust and whatever this particular phase is, other than Ireland. I mean, if you go back to the 1980s, you've got Ireland was usually referred to as the poorest of the wealthy countries of the world. It had the highest rate of national debt per capita in the world. There was a conference at the very beginning of the 1990s in Dublin that asked the question, and it wasn't ironic, is Ireland a third world country? By the end of the 1990s, Ireland has the highest rates of economic growth outside of China. It's overtaken the EU average. It's overtaken Britain's GDP. I mean, there's a remarkable historical or kind of end of historical moment, which is the 31st of August 1994, and two things happen. One is the Provisional IRA declare as of midnight they're going to stop their campaign, however we might want to characterize that campaign. And on the same day, a guy called Kevin Gardner, working in London for Morgan Stanley Bank, comes up with a phrase. He's been searching around for a while for this phrase to describe Ireland's economic miracle, and he says it's the Celtic tiger. And you have this kind of, I mean, you couldn't script it, that these two things would happen at the same day. This moment where Ireland's economic growth finds this kind of metaphor that will pop up everywhere for years to come, and this moment when Ireland appears to finally be overcoming its kind of great historical divisions and inability to overcome its past. So Ireland really does exemplify that moment of, you know, we're at the end of history. All that remains to us is the shop and occasionally the vote. And let's get on with it. And of course, the metaphor that would be used as an accusation later is that apparently we all partied, and the evidence.
Is that true? I mean, did ordinary Irish people, did they buy into it?
Yeah,
I mean, think, beyond kind of benefiting from the property bubble and all of this. I mean, did they politically buy into the vision that was sold?
I think you would have to say that many people did, because it was a time of for many people ferocious apparent progress. Many people who had never had money before had money. Many people, for example, if you had a manual trade and were in Dublin, if you were a plumber or an electrician or whatever, the money that you could earn was something that previously would have only been available to doctors and lawyers and so on. And many people during that time tutted perhaps, and I was probably one of those who kind of said, well, you know, I mean, people have kind of fallen for mammon. There's more than, you know, what about issues of equality? What about issues of public services? But I mean, certainly there was a period in the 1990s when um, uh, people people who had never experienced prosperity before got a taste of it, or at least got the impression of it. And the great totem of this was, as I'm sure you could guess, was of course property prices, and which became kind of fabled kind of topic of dinner party conversations and so on. But not everybody bought into the narrative, but it was hard to resist. One of the things at the time, there was a guy called Dennis O'Hearn who's an American sociologist who lived in Northern Ireland for a time, and he wrote the first kind of critical book inside the Celtic Tiger about that particular period. But one of the problems was that people like Dennis, interesting book, good book, came with the kind of the old categories of sort of Latin American kind of dependency, world systems theory, and kind of assumed that this was a bubble, that it was a mirage, that it was a simulacrum, whatever, and it wouldn't last. But the reality was, at a certain point, when you got the train back into Dublin in the evening, the whole skyline was full of cranes. You could smell the money, or you could certainly get a sense of not really money, credit.
So I actually had a question on this. I mean, who didn't buy into this? Was there any? Was it kind of quite a Dublin-centric phenomenon? The house prices, the cranes, that specific, I guess, fraction of the population that might have been really seeing certain benefits at this point in the mid-90s.
Yeah. And can I add to that, Colin? Sure. So just to clarify, so in addition to George's question, are you saying you're disagreeing with the dependency theory guy, and you're saying that the economic progress was genuine? It wasn't. It was stuff was built and material standards of living improved, notwithstanding, other problems. So if you could clarify that as well.
Yeah, I think the problem was for the left, and I'd include myself in this. Just to be self-critical, I think many people on the left weren't prepared for what happened to Ireland, because Ireland was. The Irish economic miracle, in inverted commas, was never meant to happen. A poor country like Ireland wasn't meant to, like Ireland in the space of a decade went from one of the poorest countries in the Western world to, on paper, the fourth wealthiest country in the world in the space of a school generation. It was something that was hard for people on the left to come to terms with. I think the initial response was to suggest this was a souffle, that this was a bubble, that this wouldn't last. But certainly, when you see apartment blocks going up, when you see cranes on the skyline, when you talk to your students and they've just come back from the Far East over the summer, when you talk to your students and they've just come back from a week in Prague during the midterm break, all of those kind of stories attest to something that was happening. And I think what happened with the left during that period, and again I include myself in this, much to my regret, was that people's a way of interrogating that particular period was through cultural categories rather than economic categories. Were about kind of morally saying, yes, there's a lot of money around, but people's lives are being ruined. There's a lot of money around, but not everybody has access to it. There's a lot of money around, but there's homelessness. There's high levels of concealed unemployment through disability. And I think that one of the problems is that Ireland has not really had, until really after the crash, a real strong tradition of critical political economy that was looking what was going on in the economy, what was likely to make it crash. And if you look at a lot of the books that come out critically of the Celtic Tiger period, they're talking about culture rather than economics, even when claiming to talk about economics, because I think people really found it very difficult to get a grasp on that. Of course, many people were excluded from the Celtic Tiger boom. Many people were forgotten during the Celtic Tiger boom, but there was something clearly very real. All booms, of course, are elements of the real and the mythic, however you distinguish between those things, because the most mythic thing of all is, of course, money. The most figurative thing of all in our lives is money, and what drove that boom, like every other boom, is credit. If somebody who earns €30,000 can buy a house worth €500,000, you don't have to be an economist to work out that there's there's a Ponzi scheme at work, and the credit lubricating the wheels. So there's always a mythical element to these things. But the response of the left was a slightly kind of actually a conservatism, a moral conservatism, which was that the fabric of Irish society was there was a rampant individualism. The I was preeminent over the we, those kinds of things, and I think everybody found it in the just the sheer kind of white heat of that moment of that decade and a half, found it very hard to get a handle on it because uh, there's very, very few societies have experienced anything quite like that. I mean, I can't quite
Yeah.
give you a sense of just how. I don't even
No,
think, you know, I mean,
you've given us a great sense of it already. I mean, just that kind of leap forward suddenly, and the left being kind of wrong-footed. I mean, I did want to really quickly make an addendum to George's question as well. In terms of those who were, like, let's say, left behind by the end of history, or maybe those who were treated as not on board with the new hip thing that's going on. You know, we're kind of nationalists and socialists as well, for that matter, treated as sort of, you know, people who hadn't let go of the old passions, let's say. How are those people treated during this period?
well, again, you see, the person who presides over this period is the classic populist in the sense of the term that used to exist. A man called Bertie Ahern, and Bertie Ahern was a working class fella who deliberately stumbled over his words to conceal the fact that he was a very, very astute political operator. And one of the things he famously said was that he was the last living socialist in Ireland. And he was a Fianna Fáil politician, and he embodied that Fianna Fáil tradition of being able to speak to all sides of the house, saying in this part of the world, to be able to speak out of both sides of your mouth at the same time. And he was very dismissive of the left because, of course, the left in Parliament was essentially the Labour Party, which is a fairly kind of historically small, reasonably conservative, quite middle class, trade union associated Labour Party, which has never had the kind of the breadth of appeal that, you know, parties, other kind of social democratic Labour parties would have had in a European context. So left voices were very marginalised, and of course those left voices, anything that was critical. I mean, one of the people who was critical of the housing boom was told by Bertie Ahern to basically go and kill himself. And Bertie Ahern was speaking at a trade union event up in the northwest of the country, up in Donegal. And when asked about the criticisms that were being made of the housing bubble and the claim that it was about to burst, he said, "I don't understand why people waste their time." I think the phrase was cribbing and moaning on the sidelines. Why don't they just go and kill themselves? Well, you know, actually during the Celtic Tiger period, many people were. And I think those voices were marginal. There was a consensus. There was a belief, you know, I mean, I'm sure you could write the script yourself. There was an end of history belief that this was it, that this was going on forever. You know, that it was a matter of dotting the I's, crossing the T's. It was all over bar the shouting, whatever those kind of phrases might apply here. And just really, there was that sense. You could see it even with students, you know, I mean, you know, trying to kind of get students to think critically about the Celtic Tiger. You could see them looking at you kind of, you know, just with that look of it, you know, if you felt like a flat earther being critical of it, because the boom kept going. That's the thing. It kept going. Every time somebody said it was going to slow, it accelerated again, of course, until the wheels came off completely. But nothing. I don't think there's a country in the Western world exemplifies that phrase, the end of history, that we've you know, that we've reached our you know, we made the desert bloom. We've reached our place in the sun. I mean, remarkable things. I you know, I remember a student many years ago telling me a story with great pride from a very, very poor part of Dublin. Her family had bought a place in Bulgaria, and you know, there was a lot of those kinds of stories. And of course, those stories would turn very dark in time. But I often think of that particular story when I think of that period of just people who probably hadn't owned a home until the last generation suddenly became the owners of property in a country a very far away. And there was a certain giddiness to the moment, you know. I think also, I mean, what's a really important part of this story, I think, in terms of what exemplified the emptiness of the Celtic Tiger boom is nothing really about economy, although there was an element of economy in it, was Ireland's role in the Iraq War. I think for a lot of people, the way in which Ireland facilitated the passage of American troops through Shannon Airport, a civilian airport in a neutral country, in contravention of international and domestic aviation laws and contravention of the Hague Treaty. I think that became a lightning rod for a lot of people, thinking we've lost our soul, we've sold out, we've lost all sense of ourselves. So I think that was a very, as it was of course everywhere else, but that was a very, very important moment. People in Ireland really, really responded to that, and I think that articulated some deeper sense of there's something not quite wrong, there's something not quite right with this picture.
So talking about the picture not being quite right, regular listeners will know that for our 100th episode, we asked several of our regular guests to discuss what they felt was the most important event or moment of the past 30 years since the end of history. And one of our regular guests, Angela Nagel, gave this anecdote about Ireland becoming obviously open to international capital, welcoming all these foreign corporations, becoming a tech hub, but there being a big conference and Ireland not having actually invested in the infrastructure to provide high-speed internet sufficiently, which kind of, at least for her, symbolized the way in the kind of hollowness of this sort of neoliberal period and the kind of growth model that it brought forward. I think maybe this might be a good moment to talk a little bit about the crisis, what Ireland actually went through, and the degree to which the EU and the Troika was actually involved. Just to maybe, as we're getting this bit of the conversation started, we've discussed on previous podcasts, Portugal, where the crisis hasn't actually led to such a destruction of the welfare state, and it occupies sort of a middle position. Greece, which rebelled and faced annihilation, and Ireland, on the other hand, on the other extreme, who seem to have completely bent over. So maybe you could explain a little bit of the historical narrative of how Ireland, I guess, bent over.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just go back just a little bit further, just give people some sense, because I'm not sure people often realize this. What happened in Ireland during that moment, the crash, 2007, 2008, what happened in Ireland was, some people would say, the most substantial economic crash that's ever happened in a wealthy country outside of wartime. Lost more than 20% of its GDP in the space of about 18 months. I mean, usually you have to go to war and lose for something like that to happen to you. I mean, it was in a European context, probably second only to Greece. One economist who came to Ireland at that time was asked for a comparison, and it was at a press conference, and he scratched his head, and he was looking for a comparator country, and he eventually actually said Zimbabwe, which of course is absurd, but in searching for it, I mean, its absurdity is very telling. What happened to Ireland was the property boom, the property bubble, of course, burst, which meant that the various taxes coming from the sales of property then disappeared. People who were working on building sites suddenly became unemployed. So the state's incomings are disappearing, its outgoings are going through the roof. And of course, in short order, there's a kind of fiscal crisis. And certainly by the latter months of 2010, it's very obvious that what was initially pitched as an aberration, a temporary crisis, a liquidity crisis, was a structural crisis in Ireland's financial system, and that the country was essentially broke. There's what's called a bailout by three agencies, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. Supposedly gives Ireland 85 billion to keep the country ticking over. The 85 billion, it turns out, is really 67.5 billion, because the other 17.5 billion is actually coming from the National Pension Fund. But it turns out that 67.5 billion isn't really 67.5 billion, because 35 billion of it will never arrive in Ireland. It's going straight into the European banking system. So we get a bailout that really isn't a bailout, not least because of the 85 billion, we end up with 32.5 billion. All of the money that we borrowed from these institutions is being paid well over the going rate. It's being paid at 5.75%. So essentially, we're what is depicted as a bailout is essentially a bailout of the European banking system that we're paying for, but we're paying for it way over the market rates at the time. And of course, in order to pay back that money, there's a sequence of 6 different austerity budgets that take about 30,000 million out of the Irish economy, that impose really quite incredible hardship in a country that, remembered serious hardship back in the 1980s and beyond.
And this is the period, if I'm right, also that Ireland began exporting people again for the first time in a generation.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the most culturally sensitive barometers, because of course Ireland is the country of traditionally of diaspora and emigration. I remember actually when Fidel Castro died, there was a very snide documentary about him on BBC Two, and one of the metrics that was used to castigate the Castro regime was that 1 in 6 people born in Cuba lived outside the country. That's exactly the figure for Ireland. Over 600,000 people left.
Wow.
During the crash. 60% of them had college degrees. Really very, very vicious austerity imposed by, in part by the Labour Party, by a party ostensibly of the left. At one point, 1 in 3 Irish children were going to bed or going to school hungry. Some really quite terrifying metrics of austerity that mirrored in many other European countries, but perhaps even more extreme. But of course, Ireland in all of this was the best boy in class. It was always the model pupil, or Yanis Varoufakis refers to it as the model prisoner. The metaphor obviously meant to mean that the country who thinks that if they play ball, they will be they will avoid some of the kind of the lash of neoliberal discipline. So
what explains this? I mean, you might have been going on to kind of clarify this, but it just seems extraordinary of this loss of 20% of GDP in 18 months, this, repeated incredible austerity. Why were the Irish and Greek paths so different? Why was there not that politicization?
Well, they're not that different. The Greeks took it, right? They had their little show referendum and then they took it. Isn't the real question as to why? So why did the Irish take it as well?
Well, the two.
I have a theory. May I put forward my theory?
Sure. Yeah.
My theory is that Alex is probably going to edit this out afterwards. But I think when the Irish gave in to the smoking ban before any other European country, then we knew that it was all over. They were going to roll over for everything. Would you say that's fair?
I mean, I think that's, maybe slightly glib as a theory, but also, if we're making the Irish-Greek comparison, the Greeks, still keep smoking away, even though there's a ban. So, maybe that gives you an idea for the contrast.
Yeah, interesting theory. Not sure quite what to do with that, but I don't.
You don't
ignore him. Just ignore him.
You can just answer my question if you want.
Has to be more tethered to the earth. I think what it is, I think it's a number of things. One is ideology. I think one is that the people who led the country through the crisis really believed that this was the only show in town, really bought the austerity argument. There was remarkably little dissent at the level of the public sphere by which I mean the political class, the journalists, the people who appear on the kind of national broadcaster and appear on the political kind of chat shows. There was a remarkable consensus. That's not to mean that everybody bought into it, but among those people who are making the decisions, there was really a sense of we are where we are. There is no alternative. All of those people wouldn't use the phrase there is no alternative because it's Thatcherite connotations, it's British connotations. But the phrase was essentially we are where we are. This is simply what we have to do. I think there was an ideological consensus, which was
so it was kind of the flip side. Sorry to cut in. It was kind of the flip side then of the depth of the end of history. So it was the fact that there was no alternative had been accepted just in the period prior. So when there was a change from good to bad, it was like, well, there was no alternative before and there's no alternative now. So, you know.
Yeah, there's certainly an echo there. I mean, I think there's a certain quotidian logic to austerity politics, which is there's a sovereign debt crisis. One way to rectify this is by spending less. The only way to spend less in the logic of, the kind of the modern neoliberal state is, of course, to hammer the people at the bottom of the pile and therefore, various forms of public provision get cut. That lovely Alexei Seal quote that austerity is the idea that the global financial crash happened because Wolverhampton has too many public libraries. That idea became kind of solidified pretty quickly. And certainly in mainstream public debate, it's not to say there weren't dissenting voices, but in terms of those people close to government, there was a consensus. The second thing that I think that was really, really important in this was the trade union movement. There was a lot of dissent. There was a lot of strands to dissent. There was a lot of grassroots dissent. But there was, until the movement against the introduction of water charges, which was mentioned in the Troika bailout, until that really took off in the autumn of 2014, there was no kind of real lightning rod for this very disparate set of this sense of this is unfair. We are the whipping boys for Brussels and Frankfurt. The people being damaged, most of the people in most vulnerable positions. The trade union movement organised 3 demonstrations that brought out more than 100,000 people on the streets of Dublin, which is the equivalent of 1.5 million in London. Marched them up the top of the hill and then did nothing with it, because the trade union movement strategy throughout the whole crisis was to get back into talks with government, which they'd been in since the late 1980s. So I think there was that. I think there was also a kind of, and this maybe goes back to the kind of, the comment about the smoking ban and political cultures and so on. There's a very strong streak of opportunistic pro-European sentiment among the political elite in Ireland. And I mean opportunistic in the sense that when it doesn't suit them to be pro-European, they simply abandon it. But one of the things that's really historically very, very important, certainly in the time I've lived in Southern Ireland, has been the approval of the European Union, the approval of people who operate at the level of the global institutions of political power. And there was, it struck me that from the word go, Irish politician was at pains to prove that they would take the hard medicine, that they would be the best boys in class, and very specifically, to go back to your point of comparison with Greece, very specifically to say they were not Greece. Back as early as 2011, Michael Noonan, who was the finance minister throughout of Fine Gael, who was the minister throughout much of the crisis, said in response, there's a famous placard in a demonstration in Greece that says, "We are not Ireland. We will resist." And in response to this, he said, "Well, I want everybody to know, yes, that's right. We are not Greece, and I'm going to have T-shirts made, and I'm going to, everybody in government's going to wear these T-shirts saying that we're not Greece." And very, very deliberately, there was an attempt to distinguish themselves from Greece. And if you look in terms of, it's very, very interesting. At a hunch, one of the things that struck me as very, very interesting when I went back to look at this period, when people started to talk about recovery, I noticed a story which was Jean-Claude Trichet made a statement to the European Parliament in, I think it was March 2010, in which he said, this is around the time of the first Greek bailout, in which he said, if Greece wants to see a model of the future, a model of recovery, they only have to look to Ireland. And I thought, well, what's happening in March 2010? People are still leaving the country. Property prices will keep falling for another 3 years. Unemployment will keep falling for another 2 years. The public finances are in such disarray that within, 8 months, there will be a bailout and the national humiliation that goes along with it. So what are the narratives around Ireland's role in this? This small country that is very, very important because there's several hundred billion of French and German bank money in the system that doesn't look as if it's going to come back. But also ideologically, it's very, very important as a hammer to beat the other pigs, but specifically to really hammer the Greeks. And the Irish political class plays this very well. But not only that,
just to say,
yeah,
who the pigs are.
So the pigs, is just that not terribly flattering acronym for those countries that were heavily indebted during the Eurozone crisis and regarded as potential contaminants of the Eurozone, which would have been Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. So Ireland would have been very much in that category. But when I looked at Jean-Claude Trichet's comment, I kind of thought that's pure ideology. I mean, we've got a country whose economy is circling the plug hole, and he's telling another country whose economy is doing precisely the same, probably at a faster rate, that they should follow Ireland. And I started tracing just through LexisNexis, which is just a very, very easy to use search engine that allows you to search, in this case, English language newspapers and to find the frequency of certain phrases and so on. And what I found was something, both predictable and remarkable, which was every time people got excited about Ireland, they weren't really talking about Ireland. Every time that somebody like Barroso or Trichet, any senior figure in the kind of global political or economic elite got very excited about Ireland, they were really talking about Greece. Every time one of these figures that Ireland was the role model, it was the good boy in class, it was the model for other countries to cover. Those stories peak, guess when? Around the times of the 3 Greek bailouts. There's a very obvious, I'm not suggesting that people sat down and strategize this, but there's a certain very obvious kind of confluence of interest between the kind of European political and financial elite, the Dublin political establishment, who think they can, if they take the hard medicine, they will somehow get out of this crisis and they won't be punished the way that the Greeks are about to be punished, appear to be about to be punished. So I think there's an interesting story here that is perhaps less well understood.
So to bring this to the kind of the present day, or to bring this to Saturday specifically, I mean, how does all of this, I guess, this history and this kind of narrative around Greece, Ireland being the good boy in class, as you said, how does this play in terms of austerity, EU austerity? How does this play into what this election means on Saturday?
Yeah, if I can just maybe backtrack just a little bit, I will answer the question, but I just want to backtrack a little bit, because in order to understand where we are, why Sinn Féin has the traction that it has, among other things, I think you have to understand Ireland, the importance of Ireland in the story of the kind of Eurozone crisis and the austerity programs that were imposed on the pigs, the countries, the badly indebted countries of the Eurozone. It was said that Ireland was the poster child for austerity. But of course, that narrative only works over a period of time if it is proved that the country that had introduced austerity is entering a period of recovery. And of course, lo and behold, in 2014, Ireland begins to register rates of economic growth, 4 or 5%, the highest in Europe, and that's continued for the last 6 years or so. So the proof of the pudding, people would have said, Ireland took the hard medicine. It is now in recovery. This is firm evidence that austerity is the road to recovery. Every other country needs to follow this path. Syriza needs to start whinging and get with the program. But here's the irony of it. The way in which Ireland kickstarted its recovery was one that has been so damaging that it may almost be about to put Sinn Féin into government. And the way it went about kickstarting its recovery was by selling off large chunks of property that had come into public ownership because the people who had built them were private property developers who had gone bust during the crash. And in 2013, a government headed by Fine Gael, Thatcherite, high establishment, the Irish Labour Party, ostensibly the left, told the public agency that held this very, very large bank of distressed property and distressed loans to start selling them to international vulture funds. And in 2013, that agency, NAMA, began talking to Wall Street vulture funds, investment companies. Would you come and buy these properties? In some cases, we'll even give you credit lines to do so. And what happens between 2013 and now is this cannibalization of Irish society by international speculative finance capital. By the end of 2016, they own 90,000 properties and they own 50,000 mortgages. And we're talking about a society here which is, the size of maybe a third of the size of London. In the place where I work, a new development just literally across the road from the campus. Every single house, what appears to be starter homes and so on for younger people, bought off plans by German vulture funds, cuckoo funds. And what has happened here is the arrival of this version of multinational capital at the same time that the central bank has put very stringent controls on mortgages, on how much you can borrow to buy a house, has meant essentially that vulture funds have distorted the residential and commercial property markets. House prices have gone up. Younger people can't buy them. Therefore, there's an increased demand on rental property. Rents in Dublin on average now are more than €2,000 a month. We have an historic...
Sorry, €2,000 a month. And what? I don't know if you know what the median wage is, to put that into some context.
Good question. I would say
it sounds like a high rent.
We would be talking about in the low 30,000s, 30 to 35,000 would be the median in income. So I would say, for example, if you're a teacher here in Ireland, and your first pay packet is probably a little below, probably 1,900 a month, and to rent a former council house in a not terribly exclusive part of Dublin may cost you 2,200 euros a month.
So basically, it's just a recovery which is completely unsustainable and has led to the massive dispossession of Irish property, and this is the miracle or the recovery.
It's a miracle which on paper, certainly if GDP meant something, or GDP meant something unproblematic, Ireland would again be the great miracle economy of the last 5 or 6 years. But the things that are driving macroeconomic growth are vulture funds and, of course, multinational capital, principally in pharmaceuticals and in information technology. One of the many quirks of Ireland's political economy is that multinational corporations are responsible for more than 90% of all exports.
I had forgotten this little fact, but I had a quick Google right before calling you up, trying to look at what Ireland's GDP and GDP per capita growth rate had been over the past couple of years. And of course, you have this absurd spike in 2015 where Ireland hit 26.3% growth, which, is such an absurdity, kind of gives lie to the whole story of Irish growth over this period and Irish recovery, right?
Yeah, and this has been the case for a very long time, because of the usual kind of accountancy practices of multinational capital. But of course, it's become accelerated in recent years for various reasons. Those figures that were released in the summer of 2016, the figure there, 26.3%, famously Paul Krugman described it as leprechaun economics, unfortunate metaphor, but one that kind of captures the absurdity of it. When the government was so embarrassed by the kind of the howls of derision that came from economists around the world, that it later actually revised those figures, and the figure was somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. But that's a classic case. What inflated those figures to 26.3% was two things. One was that Apple moved its intellectual property operations in principle to Ireland because of a tax rate reduction. And the other is that a company that leases airplanes to airlines also moved all of its operations to Ireland. So two decisions made probably by a handful of men in expensive suits and finely manicured and all the rest of it, essentially made it appear that Ireland had struck gold yet again. And, the story that some people may know, but it's always worth repeating, that summer, when those figures were released, at the end of the summer, of course, the European Commission brought out its report about Ireland's, cozy relationship with Apple. And what it said was that since 1991, the Irish state, under various kind of political flags, has had a relationship with two different relationships with Apple. That means that essentially that it pays 0.005% corporation tax, which
that's remarkable.
Hard to imagine. But what it means is for every 100,000 profit that it makes, it pays 5 cents. Which would mean that if the average person in Ireland paid that in income tax, it would mean they would pay about €1.70 a year, about 3-4 cents a week. And of course, there's something worse about this, which goes back to my comment previously about the opportunism of the Irish political establishment's love of the European Union, which is the money that's being moved through Ireland isn't money generated in Ireland, principally. And when it comes to Apple, it is money that it's being, every time somebody goes into and buys an iPhone in Munich or Maastricht or Milan or Madrid, essentially that money appears as if it's happened in Ireland, as if those purchases have happened in Ireland. And essentially it comes through two front companies in Ireland, and it then disappears to a headquarters that actually doesn't exist. While paying.
So sorry, just to interrupt you, because
Sure.
it would be good to, with all this context in mind, to come back to the election and to discuss it in terms of, well, we don't know what will happen, and maybe listeners will be listening to this after the election. But do you think with this context, with this dislocation, that all these economic effects are finally finding political repercussion in the fact that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil might no longer be as kind of hegemonic parties as they used to be, and that this might provide room not just to Sinn Féin, which has been in the polls, but for other left-wing parties? I mean, what do the prospects hold there?
Yeah, I think there's a huge distinction in Irish society between people who own property and people who don't, people who own their own homes and people who don't. And people who own their own homes are generally doing better than they were and emerging from the chaos. Those who don't, and that's about 800,000 people who are in the rental sector, are facing problems that are really, really, really quite inconceivable. Younger friends, all the stories that I'm sure people can predict, people, these kind of extended adolescence of people in their 30s and 40s living at home, having to people move back in with their parents, people crashing in French cities. And I think we've got the kind of breaking point, because we have a society that generates huge amounts of wealth, on paper is one of the wealthiest societies in the world, but in which public services are very, very poor. To see a doctor in Dublin, unless you're on a very, very low level of income, you have to pay for a prescription. I'm from Belfast. In Belfast, it's free to see a doctor, and it's free for everybody to go and get their prescription after their doctor's visit. In order to go to the emergency room, to go to A&E in the local hospital, there's one just around the corner from me. To get across the door, you have to pay €100 to get seen by somebody. We have a crisis, the highest number of people ever on trolleys in Irish hospitals. We've got 10,500 homeless people, and we've got 4,000 homeless children. Real crisis. And we have this, as you say, this dislocated, this bipolar society. And I think Fine Gael, up until probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, it looked as if the narrative of recovery might get them in a position where they might form a government, but their vote is unraveled. The leader of the party, Leo Varadkar, who featured on the cover of Time magazine, the son of an immigrant, a man who happens to be gay, in a society where homosexuality was illegal within living memory, is a very Thatcherite figure, a very distant figure, and I think his persona seems very uncaring. It seems very detached, very remote. And I think, again, that's something that's in the kind of televised debates. I think people have come to see him as just somebody who simply doesn't care. Fianna Fáil are still. Sorry. Yeah.
I wanted to kind of pull out, I suppose, from the immediacy of the election, and to ask a broader question about what Sinn Féin might represent for relations with Britain, and particularly the question of unification. So it seems to me that unification is back on the agenda, and perhaps is likelier than it has been for a generation, perhaps for many generations. So with the issue being that the British state is effectively relinquishing its hold on Ireland. It has been for a while, but more recently, the fact that the Tories have ended their alliance with the Democratic Ulster Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, and also that as part of the Brexit agreement with the European Union, they've accepted a customs border in the Irish Sea, which is to say that the 6 counties of Northern Ireland remain effectively economically part of the European Union and more integrated into Southern Ireland, into the Republic. Sinn Féin, obviously, historically has been the party that rejected the border between North and South and opposed partition. And so the fact that they're now surging in the polls, that they look like they'll be in a position to at least be in pole position to try and form a government. I wonder where that puts the question of unification in your mind, whether it brings it closer, and how Sinn Féin, if Sinn Féin does end up on top, how that puts it with relation to the North.
Yeah, I mean, 2 very interesting questions here. I mean, maybe take them in the reverse order to the way they were asked. The second question, really, about Irish unification, is a very, very complex one. And of course, I mean, I'm from Northern Ireland. I've lived in Southern Ireland for a very long time. North of the border, the issue of where Northern Ireland was going to be for the foreseeable future was essentially settled for the foreseeable future until the Brexit referendum. I mean, all opinion polls showed, at best within the nationalist community in Northern Ireland, ambivalence towards the prospect of United Ireland. It just didn't seem to be something that was on the cards. South of the border, my own experience is, it's hard to generalise, but as a Northern Irish person who's taught courses about Northern Ireland for 25 years south of the Irish border, I could probably count the number of people who I've met who were fiercely interested in Northern Ireland, who didn't have a direct family connection to Northern Ireland. I could probably count them in the fingers of one hand, certainly could count them in the fingers of 2. But certainly it does feel at times that the genie's out of the bottle, that the Brexit debate has stirred.
This is what, I mean, to me, this is what's so interesting about it. And I mean, it'll be mirrored over here in the UK as well, or in Britain as well, because nobody, I mean, it was so striking in all of the debates in British politics over the last few years. Nobody cares about Ireland. And least of all the people, the Conservative and Unionist Party that claims to be founded on preserving the union with Ireland. So it's very, despite the fact, like you say, that on both sides of the Irish Sea, nobody seems to care passionately about it. Yet it seems to be happening almost irrevocably and against anybody's particular will, and it's astonishing.
Yeah, no, it's one of the great historical ironies, that certainly the Democratic Unionist Party, the Ulster Unionist Party, historically the largest but now the smaller of the two unionist parties, wasn't in favour of Brexit. But certainly the DUP, of course, was a conduit for a lot of dark money to support Brexit from across the water. But the DUP and those who voted for Brexit and those who advanced the case for Brexit have imperiled the union. This was, I saw people interviewed on television and experts drew their attention to this, but they didn't seem to be capable of realizing the great threat to the union that Brexit might represent under certain circumstances.
So I suppose the question for the Sinn Féin is, even if their electoral kind of success, if it's based on the backwash of the crisis, the kind of the economic and social grievances that you mentioned in terms of the decay of public services, the fact that they they have working class support south of the border, their historic role and their political justification has been unification. So if they do come out in pole position, it's something they have to address. Independently of whether or not it's an immediate electoral priority, it's something which they will have to orient around. So how do you think they'll do it?
Well, the thing is, nobody knows how they can do it. I mean, there's two issues here. One is, do they want a border poll? The Good Friday Agreement allows for a border poll. Do Sinn Féin want a border poll? On some occasions they say, yes, we do. On other occasions they say, yes, we do at some point in the future. At other occasions they dodge the issue. The second problem is, for anybody who wants a vote on Irish unity, is that nobody knows the specific mechanism by which this will come about. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement only allows that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland will be obliged, if there is evidence of sufficient will for United Ireland, to create the conditions where people can vote on that eventuality. So there's a lot of straws in the wind. I think what happened, you have to remember as well, I mean, Sinn Féin was very, very lukewarm during the Brexit debate. It didn't even register with the Electoral Office in Belfast to be one of the parties involved in the debates around Brexit. It's been a very unwitting kind of beneficiary of the chaos that's come from Brexit. Of course, it's the main plank of their programme. It's the thing that we all identify with Sinn Féin. But the problem for Sinn Féin is they can overplay their hand. What happens if there is a border poll about Irish unity? What happens if it loses? What happens if it is called too early? What happens if we have like a kind of situation similar to Scotland? What happens, my understanding is that there will have to be simultaneous referenda both sides of the border. What would happen south of the border, where people's attitudes to Northern Ireland and Irish unity are deeply, deeply ambivalent? What we found over the last couple of days, when the media and the other parties have dredged up issues of Northern Ireland's violent past and Sinn Féin's prominent role and Republicans' prominent role in that, is that people get very, very nervous about that very, very quickly. So Sinn Féin is in a very, very delicate position where, if it were in a position to voice an argument for a border poll and not do so, it may be regarded as hypocritical and losing momentum. And of course, it's raison d'etre. Why would it not do that? If it calls it too early, it could be a strategic error. If it advances it too rapidly, it can alienate opinion, particularly south of the border, which, as I say, is very, very ambivalent. It's a difficult one.
Huge amount to play for. There. Colin, I'm going to have to cut you off there, but thank you so much. That was actually, you've very brilliantly illustrated the current Irish context, its history, and all that there is to play for in these elections. So thanks so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the invitation. Good to talk to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it was wonderful, and we need to get you back on to talk about the clash.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, just don't get me on to talk about Morrissey. That would break my heart.
Yeah, I don't think we have that in the pipeline at any point in any future that we might have. Yeah,
that's reassuring to know. Okay, thanks, lad. Thanks again.
Cheers.
Cheers.